Hi, my name is Janice Switlo, and recently we're all become aware that arrests have taken place of Mohawks who have expressed support for the events and issues in place at Wet'suwet'en. And I want to express that presuming the police had arrested on the basis of an injunction, that CN Rail is not in a position to maintain and be awarded an injunction. Why? It's an equitable remedy, and in order to obtain it, you must have clean hands. And what I'm going to describe to you right now is the fact that CN Rail does not have clean hands. And this goes back to the 1990s, when I brought to CN Rail's attention the fact that many of these glamorous hotels were not lawfully structured and set up. What am I talking about? The Crown is granted permissions to do certain things, and that can include taking up land. So put aside the issue whether a railway per se is one of those permissions. I won't deal with that right now. But assuming it is, for our purposes, then it was critical for, and it was laid out in legislation that says here are the terms upon which a railway can be put in place. And it was very restrictive. It was only where the tracks need to go and a little bit for a platform, for instance, at each station. Instead, huge chunks of land were taken from reserves, and huge hotels were put on them. And those hotels have made a lot of money through the years. So I explained that because the legislation governing that Crown Corporation restricted what they could do, what they could take up and use for purposes of a railroad, the fact that all of these expensive properties were located on lands that remained native land, remained Indian reserves, and as such are the property of those particular bands where those reserves are located. Now, there was no question about this, and remember, this would not have been a Section 35 legislative basis upon proceeding. This is on the basis that the legislation allowing for lands to be taken up was not followed. So immediately, we had a big meeting, and all the chiefs there, and a vice president showed up, and he was a classic Indian agent look, right? Old man, white hair, authoritative. So as I expressed and went through the brief, and I provided them with a full legal brief, okay? I'm not doing that here today for time's purposes, but I did it, as I always do, I do things in writing, and I'm very upfront. Here's what the facts are, here's the consequences, here's what I can do with these facts. And so, of course, as I finished, summarizing and discussing what what the issues were, he looked at me in the presence of the chiefs and he said, okay, we've seen what you can do. Now watch what I can do. And this man proceeded, I really wouldn't have believed this if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. And I had spent time with these chiefs. They were fully prepared, fully raring to go, were ready to move, and we were doing things. And keep in mind, these are multiple $billion in damages, okay? Because under equitable principles, waiver of tort, every single dollar earned by those properties, as well as the properties themselves, the buildings, etc., all of that, lawfully under Canadian law, belong to the Indian bands. So what happens? He starts to speak to these chiefs in a very derogatory, authoritarian way, as if speaking to children. And what I saw is like pushing a button that had been installed in these people, in these chiefs, when they were children, as students of residential schools. It was really disheartening to see. And he gloated and he spoke about them and he was open about, look at what I can do. You see how I can control these people? Do you see what we can do? This is how we make things happen. And to be honest, I mean, I'm not usually at a loss for words, but I was quite shocked by this. And of course, right after that meeting, the chiefs were a little worried about going ahead. There was some minor presents, if you will, that were granted and given. A few dollars flowed into some of these bands. And immediately what happened is CN Rail took action. What did they do? They sold off the hotels. Fairmont picked up many of those. Sold off the hotels because in Canadian law there's a concept that if a third party without notice purchases, then they won't be removed from, and they'll be able to retain those properties, for instance. The second thing they did is privatize CN Rail. And the third thing was to amend the legislation that I had pointed out limited the operations of these railroads and how land could be taken and for what purposes. So effectively leaving the Crown Corporation dissolved, not having assets, the shares were transferred. It wasn't an asset sale. It was because we have this situation where Canada Rail took very seriously what I had to say. Their lawyers clearly would have reviewed what I provided and agreed with me. So damage control took effect immediately. And so CN Rail, as a Crown Corporation, knowingly and with the intention, sold these things off in order to protect its position. Now, is it fair to say that CN Rail, now the public company, is in a position of clean hands? I submit no. I submit that because it's a share transfer, that the liabilities also were transferred, notwithstanding this third party without notice. CN Rail knew exactly what they were doing in terms of limiting their liability and exposure in the manner which I clearly laid out. So now we have Indigenous nations deprived of billions of dollars. That's not an overstatement. In fact, I couldn't even calculate. I have a commerce degree too. I couldn't even calculate the damages. What part of the step would have been to hire someone who could actually, go back and calculate these things. It was just too big a project for me to do that. That's the magnitude of what's owed. And instead we have Mohawks on their land. My understanding is they were not actually blocking the railroad. They were right beside the railroad, but they're on their land. And the commentary is that I have not seen the injunction proper, but the commentary by the Mohawks affected and arrested by it are saying, look, we're not violating this injunction. And what irreparable harm, that's another aspect of an injunction that's required, what irreparable harm were they causing by their actions? They were offering an example that was being followed, I guess, by many people. That's not unlawful. So again, what clean hands, what magnitude of damages? Compare what's owed to the Indigenous nations in terms of the unlawful actions of CN Rail. It was since, the early 1900s until they reacted to what I had to say about their wrongdoing. So let's put this into perspective. Why would the courts be supporting an entity with unclean hands and not supporting the legal standing upon which the Mohawks in this particular example stand? Thank you for your time.